They've identified, like you have as well, the bloated curriculum, and they've identified that teachers are not enjoying it. Students are not enjoying it. This should be fun. Learning should be fun. And if it isn't fun and you're not bringing the world to the student, we're doing it wrong. So I think that this is the challenge. But I think the work that I've been doing over the last few years has really been more about the blended learning pedagogic model, not just for schools, but to look at it across the whole spectrum of education. I think it's a little thing we have to do, lots of little things, and we all have to make one small step rather than, some of us make a giant step. We all have to step forward. I think that that's important, that parents are involved, teachers are involved, students are involved, the government understands that they're listening, regulatory frameworks are loosened so that we can support greater innovation in the classroom and that we can get the right tools into the hands of the teachers. I think that's critical. But I think that idea of pulling that playfulness through the whole curriculum, I think there's this idea of there's almost quite a negative idea of educators. And I think we need to change that culturally, because I don't think we're ever going to produce the best educated children while we've got a view that, all educators are just sort of sitting around doing nothing. But what's interesting about the model, I think, is that, you've got curriculum, you've got skills, you've got social and personal. And actually, the model is blending that.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Edufuturists podcast. We are pleased that you are joining us again. And we've got another guest in the studio joining us. Quite happy. We won't talk about where it is, but very happy this morning as we're recording this podcast. And in fact, it's somebody that we've heard on a little snippet, and a few people mentioned that was a great little conversation based on something that we did at the Brilliant Festival in Liverpool. And it's great to be able to have an extended conversation today. So, before we get into that though, Steve, is there anything that you want to tell our audience? Anything exciting that's going on in your world right now?
Nothing. Just pretty plain, pretty simple. I've got a new force delivery for some nutrition stuff, so I'm pretty excited about that. Other than that, that's as boring as and exciting as I get, I suppose, at the minute. So yeah, can't really say anything. How about you, man?
Well, the most exciting thing in my life right now is my World Cup sticker collection. I'm absolutely loving getting them Panini World Cup. It's like being a 10 to 15-year-old boy all over again. Yeah, the shinies, the swapsies, it's all happening. And in fact, apparently, if you're listening, Gaz Lewis, I'm sorry, buddy, and I'm sorry to your family that I influenced you, because you sent me a picture, once I mentioned it, you sent me a picture of it in your Tesco shopping basket, and you've probably fallen into that rabbit hole as well. Of wasting time on that, but is it wasting time if you're enjoying it? I don't know. But
I don't know if was it you that mentioned this or somebody else, Ben, that if because it's the expanded World Cup and the amount of teams that's in it, to complete without swaps would cost you £3,000. I don't know if you know that.
I didn't know that, but sorry, because
well, I'm the one who got you involved in it, remember? Because I was like, "Oh boy, for all day," and then somebody told me this date, and I was like, "That's not true." I looked it up, and I was like, "Well, you ain't completing it unless we get swaps." That is it. Let's
I
go.
reckon I've done it.
Well,
True
to be
story.
fair, absolutely, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely is. Should we get started anyway? We're talking about. I want to talk to World Cup tickets.
Let's talk about the World Cup. It's just so much more interesting.
Yeah.
Only joking.
So we are joined in the studio by a guest. Like I kind of mentioned in that little intro that we spoke to her at the Brilliant Festival and up in Liverpool, and a lovely city. Get involved if tickets are available again for Brilliant Festival 2026. If you haven't booked up, that's in November. But would you just give us a little bit of an intro to you and who you are and how you got to where you are?
I'm not sure that I want to bore all your wonderful viewers on my CV, but I suppose, well, I've done quite a few things, quite a few different things in a way. Most recently, I've set up a company, and so the main focus of what we're doing at the moment is building our immersive experiences, because we want to transform the experience of students in the classroom. So we've been working with a primary school in the Midlands to develop a whole range of immersive and interactive tours that the teachers can then use as a classroom tool. So we've been co-designing it and co-developing it with the teachers. So that's sort of, I suppose, the big the big news in terms of what I'm doing at the moment. And my company Waypoint was established in June 2024. And we've already been doing some really exciting projects, including something with the UK Space Agency, looking at test engineering and building skills, as well as working with primary, secondary schools. So we're really excited about that. My background, so I was a researcher, so I was an international researcher in digital technologies, mainly in educational areas, and over time I've set up 3 research labs, including Serious Games Institute at Coventry University. It seems like quite a long time ago now. But I also then moved into executive roles in universities, so I've been a Deputy Vice Chancellor academic in Australia and in the UK. So I've had the privilege of leading university academic teams in 2 continents. And I've also run a school during lockdown. I ran the largest school in the UK for a couple of years, which was a lot of excitement. 4,000 children in the school from 7-year-old, and there was a college as well. And then we had a separate school which was for excluded children, so we had 1,000 excluded children as well. So I've had a lot of experience of researching the digital area, but also as sort of as a manager and a director, but also on the executive level. And at the moment, I'm a governor at Sunderland University, so I've kept my link with the North through that role, and that's been an exciting journey as well, really, to watch how University of Sunderland has gone from, I think it was 77th position in the league table for universities when I joined in 2019, and now it's in the top 20. So that journey with Sir David Bell has been an amazing journey, actually, and I was only going to stay for 1 term. I ended up, I think I'm on my 3rd term now. But it's just been such an amazing sort of experience, and I've just been really lucky, So living and working in Australia, I studied in Holland, in the Netherlands, when I was doing my PhD, and also obviously I've worked all over in London, in the South, in the North, and in the Midlands. So yeah, I've just had a lot of fun, really, both supporting education and learning, but also trying to transform how we teach, transform how we learn, and using the technologies not to replace teachers, but to facilitate more exciting teaching. Because at the end of the day, we need to focus on that. And I think what we're seeing in the schools is behavioural issues and so on. And a lot of that comes from too much content, too much curriculum, old-fashioned assessments, and we need to make these changes. And I'm very passionate about supporting educators to do that. So that's sort of very long story short. But at the moment, I'm doing like lots of crazy stuff, like working as a consultant, doing assessments. I work with the Middle East quite a lot, doing assessments of universities and university departments, that sort of thing. So yeah, so I've got a sort of a unique sort of background of research management, but also actually management and industry involvement. So this is my 3rd company. That's my first startup company. So that's sort of very long, boring story short.
Yeah, to be involved in emerging technology for such a long period of time, have you seen a big sea change in regards to, one, the technologies that are emerging, but also, secondly, how they've been responded to and how they've been embraced, especially at university level? Do you find that actually they're more likely to embrace technology rather than just being a blackboard, a lecture, and a seminar kind of style of learning, and ultimately what's the engagement? And then we definitely want in the immersive space. What does that look like? Like we come from an FE background, and ultimately everybody gets funded for an actual immersive room, but ultimately the actual pedagogical and the actual impact of the technology with the software and the staff and the training and everything else is secondary. But let's go to the emerging technologies, what's changing, and also the response to it across the sector, but particularly HE.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, because for me, one of my observations, and I think I'm quite unique. Now, there are some others. So David Bell, for example, worked in a policy level. Actually, he was an undersecretary in the government, but he was also a head teacher before that. So he's been a head teacher and a head of a university. And Sir Anthony Seldon as well has also run a school and a university. But there aren't that many of us that have had that pleasure. And I think what I learned, having had, the two schools actually, and then having sort of seen just the differences actually between primary, secondary, FE and HE, and having that ability to see all of it and to see where the issues are as well in terms of transitions between. That's made me even more passionate to say, look, we really need to look at this, because my feeling is there isn't a holistic approach. When we take a holistic approach and when we use a blended approach, the technology usage is excellent and it's really good and it is transformative. What's happened, and it was interesting because during lockdown, this is quite an interesting story, I suppose, in a way. I worked actually, because I'd worked with digital technology in universities, I knew what they could do. When the lockdown came, I actually went to the poor guy, the poor CEO of Labster, which is a fantastic product which has been around for quite a long time, and it's basically 3D science lab experiments. And it was designed for universities, but of course they hadn't designed it for college use or for school use. So I nagged them and made them do it, sort of thing. And in the end, they did it. And it was quite different because they had to work with our teachers to sort of take the things that they had done at very much for university level and then try and adapt that into FE level and into younger ages. So, they had to make the lessons shorter. They had to have, more feedback. And there were certain things that they did to make it accessible for our age range. But that was a really good example where if I hadn't been in universities, I wouldn't have known about Labster. I wouldn't have known about all the other tools that are out there and are available. And I wouldn't have probably thought of going directly to the CEO to say, can you do this, please? And then transform, potentially science teaching in secondary and further education. So it's sort of those bits of knowledge that you have that are so sort of random, but somehow they're actually quite useful. But when it comes to actually pulling some of that into secondary, one of the reasons that we've started with primary with our product, which is part of the Dream Park set of tours, virtual tours, is because I knew that there wasn't actually very much for primary, actually. And that surprised me because, I just, being in universities, you tend to sort of see the case studies and the really good stuff. You don't necessarily see what's happening, in the classroom every day. So I was quite surprised actually at how primary, and the other thing I noted about primary and secondary was, and what I call the bloated curriculum. There's too much content and there's not enough time for teachers to really engage and build skills, and also for group work, student group work, and we know that that's hard at certain ages as well. So, there's a lot of pedagogic bits that need to be pulled together to really make a more holistic approach to education. And I think this is what's needed. So I've published this in my book, in Education in Computer-Generated Environments. I've also published it more recently in a research report, which is available on my LinkedIn profile, to try and say, look, we need a pedagogic approach, which is different, which is blended, which is immersive, which is interactive, which allows teachers to really have control over what they do, to have more creativity, and importantly, I think, to have more time and less rigid assessments, of course. So for me, that's sort of, it all sort of links together. The technology is part of that transformation, but for me, it's not the whole transformation. The bigger piece is teacher training, is the access that they have, is the pedagogic underpinnings, is the research that underpins the whole sector. And that's why I've been very keen to try and establish a new research council in information and education sciences, because I believe that the research is out there, but it isn't in a form that teachers can easily access. So there's a whole piece of work that needs to be done around bringing the data set together, finding what really works and what doesn't, and then making that something which the teachers can pick up and run with, because they don't have time, to go through papers, and they don't have necessarily the skills to do the sort of, high level research we can do in universities. So universities have benefited from that, but I don't think the rollout from that has been that good into the other sectors of education, and that's where I think we need to focus in the next few years.
Yeah, I think, and that resonates with a lot of what we are saying too, in terms of less stuff, more space is the less academic way of saying what you've said, in terms of we've been saying that the curriculum is full at every level, and we are just putting more stuff into it. We do a review and put more stuff into it rather than taking anything out of it. Assessment is, like you said, very, very rigid, and it requires us to think differently around everything from an education perspective, and like that ability to do that hybrid and blended space. The fact that you've been in that online space or hybrid space during the pandemic, it quite significantly, I think, is important as a context into what you're talking about in this space. That it's not just theoretical or from a university; you've actually lived and breathed this in that space as well. I wonder if I could just push back a little bit on that last bit that you were saying, which was about how universities have benefited from the research and allowed some of these things to run, but it hasn't necessarily trickled down into other factors of education. Do you really think that that's happened in universities? Because I wonder whether universities are still just a 3-year degree that could have been done in one, that it's very much academic qualification. It has to be done in a certain way, and it's still very rigid, essay-based, most courses. So I suppose my question really is: has university really changed based on this research that we've got in space? Now there might be pockets of it, but is that in the system, would you say?
Yeah, I think that the one of the ways that I can sort of point to it is through the through the lockdown and through the pandemic, which is where how resilient was that sector when we had to pivot. And if you look at the university sector, you know, all of everything is online. We've got learning management systems that have been in place for 10, 15 years, but they're just completely naturally used all the time. Do you know what I mean? So the technology is just, it was so easy to pivot. But if you look at primary schools, for example, they struggled a lot because they're not on the same level technically. They don't have the infrastructure technically in many cases, not all cases. But comparatively.
But I wonder if that is something to do with independence of adults as opposed to young adults, as opposed to, and I don't know. I'm not saying whether it was a technological, and I also don't want to push and suggest that just because we've got an online learning system or an LMS doesn't necessarily mean that we've got the pedagogic understanding of not death by PowerPoint and instructor-led learning. Do you see what I mean?
No, I take your point. But I mean, if you look at, for example, one of the universities I worked at was Curtin University in Western Australia. Something like, at the time, it's quite a lot more actually now, but at the time I think it was something like 54,000 students. We had a team there of developers that have basically, from that group of developers, Moodle came and Echo 360 came. The guy that developed these was working in my team. So we had units that were just for pedagogy, and we had units that were just developing technology. I mean, you just can't compare that with any school that I've ever I suppose our school was really good. We had a really strong IT team. We were really good at keeping systems up. But, if somebody had said to us, go and develop something from scratch that everyone's going to use in 10 years, it's just not, you can't compare, it's not comparable. So, you're talking about very, very different elements in education. And of course, if you've got, 50 of the best developers in some of the best Australian developers in your team, you're going to be producing some really good quality outcomes. And of course, in Australia, everything is remote, so we were in a good place, technically, not just because technically the teachers were good or technically we were good and we could build stuff, but just the mindset was right. People were open to using technologies there as well. And I think it's the same in the UK. I mean, we've slowed down a lot because I think there's been a lot of regulatory drag, let's say. And we also suffer from a bloated curriculum, I would say. And some areas are much more traditional. For example, we did a study actually when I was in Australia, and we found that all of the computer science courses that were taught in Australia at that time were all assessed completely by examination only. So that's where there's some differences between cultures as well. In the UK, we have a lot more assessment that's not, examination based. But as we know, there was a government that came in. I'm not going to get political, but there's a government that came in and they believed in final examinations, and that's sort of why we were going on a pathway to more project based, and we were taken off that path. And I think as soon as we get back onto the project based path, we're kicking it out the park again. And the reality is, however much you don't like the higher education system in the UK, I mean, it's a powerful force, and internationally, it's a good force, and it's a force for good. And when you look at the number of people, heads of state that have been educated from all over the world, that have been educated in UK higher education institutions, I mean, you've just got to, at some level, sort of admit that we are good at this.
Yeah, and to be
not that
fair,
you're
I'm not.
but yeah.
No, and I'm not anti-university. Please, let's just clarify that I'm not anti-British universities at all. I think the conversation is, and interestingly, I was at a symposium just the other week, having this discussion with international universities as well as UK universities about what the impact of AI in education is having and what that might look like, and therefore, it was a wonderful conversation where there is some flexibility and freedom. It's I suppose the conversation of there's a concept that, and I think most people in FE and in secondary and primary would say that the people that are making the decisions about what education looks like are universities, assessment organisations, and Ofqual in that space. So therefore, they feel like they're almost powerless in some of that conversation, and which is not a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad or a good thing. I'm just suggesting. And so, yeah, please don't think that I'm there. And Steve, did you want to jump in on that in terms of what you were thinking?
Yeah, I just think COVID. I think it's across all sectors. I'll be honest. I think further education is a very sleeping giant in regards to its approach to blended learning. I think primary and secondary we still have this belief of unless they're in the four walls of a building, they can't learn, which is really interesting because the amount of homework that comes home to me as a parent. So clearly, Joe, that's that. And I think the challenge for universities from the conversations I had when I was in my previous role was the amount of investment and the amount of income that comes from international learners, but also letting and people being on the campus is quite a challenge, because if actually that's a big significant proportion of your revenue as a business, actually to shift is going to take time, because ultimately if you're then saying, well, do all your learning online, or you have a choice, but you're making such an income from those streams, actually that's a real challenge for higher education. But also land-based in FE as well is very similar. Anything that has rooms and students living on campus or and around the area is a real challenge, I think. And I think that's one of the issues that universities face, because I remember in COVID of if we're not having face-to-face learning, well, what we're paying for? That was a whole thing. And to be fair, COVID was a challenging time because the people at university couldn't even go out and socialise, which, let's be honest, is a massive part of higher education in terms of its structure, the social element, and all of those kind of bits as well. So when you talked about serious games, I think it's the research around that. Let's step into that. What did that look like in serious gaming? What was that research, and is that influencing greater dissection across the UK, or is it actually an international project that is still international and is still over there, it's not filled across?
I sort of don't know how to answer that in a way, because it's been a journey, I think, is probably the way to talk about it. Because a lot of the technologies that we have now, we actually did have like 10 years ago, but there wasn't a technology sort of readiness, I think, for it at that time. So, it's a really good example of, I always talk about this, stereoscopic technology, because of course, as you know, that was Charles Brewster, whenever it was, end of the 1800s, to develop this technology, and of course it wasn't really used for probably about 100 years, and like now it's of course significant in all 3D immersive environments. So some technologies, do you know what I mean, they need to be ready, the time has to be ready, and I do think this is our second go at this, of bringing more game-based approaches in. It's something that I've implemented myself in the school, and I think I mentioned that we had 2 schools. One was for excluded children, and for those children it felt very much like we were just ticking boxes. We weren't really getting through. We were just trying to use the same pedagogic approaches and just louder. Let's just say it louder at them, and then they'll be good at text-based learning. And the problem was these kids were just not, it wasn't a way for them to learn. So that's why I built the game platform and was delivering game-based curriculum there. So for me, the science has been proven, and I actually went back and looked at the paper that I published in 2010. Right, so that was the first. It was a pragmatic a pragmatic control trial rather than a randomized control trial. But what we found there was that the game-based approach was more effective than the normal approach. Now, after that, a lot of other people have published in this area, and there've been more rigorous studies done, and we've seen that this is the case. And this is a really good example of how there's a disconnect between the research base and what's happening in the classroom and the lecture halls. So we have the evidence. I was very excited, by the way, when we did this study. It wasn't a finding we weren't expecting the finding for game-based to be more effective than conventional. We were expecting it to be no significant difference because, of course, most of the studies that have been done with online, comparing online and traditional, no significant difference, which is already quite a good thing. So the fact that game-based was improved, and of course we know that blended education moves you up. So you're either going for the traditional model or you're going to go for the game-based blended model. To me, it's just like, it's almost, there's an ethical reason why we should be doing this. And so I thought, in my young, naive headset space, that people they'll see this, but they didn't see it. And that's when I realized that it's just not enough to have the data in front of people. There's a whole minds and hearts piece to any sort of transformation program you do, whether that's for, just 5,000 students out in Singapore, or whether that's, 2 or 3 people that or whether that's 1,000 kids in your school. These are all, major challenges for us. And, for me, you've got to follow the science. You've got to be evidence-based. But no, this is not the case. So it's been a very interesting journey because I've had to, first of all, I had to sort of go and speak to boards and say what serious games were. So that was probably the first few years. And then I realized, well, why am I doing this? Because there's clearly a generational split here. These guys have not grown up with technology. They don't understand it. They don't feel secure with it, and they're not going to commission something they don't understand. So that's just the way it is. So I knew with getting that sort of pushback, I knew, and I wrote this up in the book. If you read the book, you'll see it actually in there quite clearly, that the blocks weren't going to be the teachers. They weren't going to be the students. They were going to be the boards. So that's where the generational split, I think, sort of began. And then over time, obviously that split has gone away because a lot of that generation, well, they're not in the workplace anymore, so it's a different situation. And people of my age, and I guess your ages as well, would have grown up with technology, and it's no big deal, and would have played games our whole lives. And it's just like, well, why don't we use this there? So this was basically what we found in the research. And to be honest with you, I haven't really changed my position since then, because it's really been proven. The teachers have been absolutely behind it. The students have been, why isn't all our learning like this, is what we got in every evaluation we did. So we know that they're on board. Now the boards are changing, and because of COVID, I think that was a big game changer as well. I think there will be changes because immersive it's just so much more effective. And I think you've got to go where the evidence is. And so from my point of view, there has been a certain frustration, I have to say. But I sort of recognized it quite early. So I knew, people have to be ready for this, and they just weren't. So I feel now is a different time. I think the generational changes have happened. I think people have recognized that there are problems with the text-based curriculum. They've identified, like you have as well, the bloated curriculum, and they've identified that teachers are not enjoying it. Students are not enjoying it. This should be fun. Learning should be fun. And if it isn't fun, and you're not bringing the world to the student, we're doing it wrong. So I think that this is the challenge. But I think what's really happened is that the scale of the challenge has been also quite difficult for people to sort of get their heads around. So I think there has been pushback in that respect. But I think the work that I've been doing over the last few years has really been more about the blended learning pedagogic model, not just for schools, but to look at it across the whole spectrum of education. And that's what I've published in the recent report. So I've tried to sort of say, look, this is what we kind of need to do. And I've tried to create that dialogue. And I know that the educators are on board because I speak to them, and I have a good community around me on LinkedIn and so on. And do join my community on LinkedIn if you are an educator and you do want to transform things. But I don't think it's a huge thing we need to do. I think it's a little thing we have to do, lots of little things, and we all have to make one small step rather than, some of us make a giant step. We all have to step forward one step. And I think we can really make our education what we want it to be. And I think that that's important, that parents are involved, teachers are involved, students are involved, the government understands that they're listening, regulatory frameworks are loosened so that we can support greater innovation in the classroom and that we can get the right tools into the hands of the teachers. I think that's critical.
Yeah, I would agree, and we're smiling because on a number of fronts. One, the community, the groundswell of people doing it is definitely there. We're feeling that and seeing that, and obviously right against that there's a push against it as well. But also the involvement. You mentioned parents there, and obviously most people who listen to the podcast regularly will know that we've got a book that's due to be out. It might even be out by the time people listen to this. About which is for parents, about pick and mix education is a spot of it. But interestingly, you mentioned there about learning supposed to be fun. We have had a few people on the podcast before who said that learning isn't about being fun. Learning is about impact and improving people's life chances, and they actually saw that as a dichotomy, that it's not about edutainment, which is, I don't think either of us are any person who's talking about play-based learning or learning that's enjoyable, and we laughed in the same way. Well, we tried not to laugh as explicitly when we've had that conversation, but realistically, it feels like there is polarization in education. There's some people think it needs to be rigorous, it needs to be academic, it needs to be silent corridors, it needs to be instructive, and not fun. And then there's those of us probably on the other side of the spectrum that are saying it doesn't. You can have rigor, academic integrity, good learning, and students enjoy it at the same time, right?
Yeah. Why are the two mutually exclusive? I mean, if you're a good teacher,
yeah.
you know that. You know you have to make it entertaining. And, if you think back to, when you were at school yourself, what are there any lessons you remember? If they are, why do you remember it? And generally you remember it because you were you either going on a school trip. This is my memory anyway. You're either going on a school trip or there was something particularly interesting about that lesson, like it was a drama class or something, or, you were working in a group. Those are things that I remember. I don't know, maybe others are different, but, it's those moments of joy. And I'm a scientist myself, and I believe in rigor. And certainly as you get into university level, obviously it's not all going to be, walk in the park, but the reality is you need to engage, certainly in primary and secondary, and I think most people accept that in primary, play is a massive part of learning. But I think that idea of pulling that playfulness through the whole curriculum, and this is why I think, I don't think educators get, I think they get a rough time for nothing. And to be honest with you, if you look at the quality of some of the teaching in the universities, it is brilliant. And, the teachers are using amazing tools. I mean, Labster we talked about earlier, I mean, that's quite an old tool, really. I mean, there's some amazing things out there that teachers can use, and they do use them. And I think the idea that teachers aren't innovating already is also not right. And I think there's this idea of there's almost quite a negative idea of educators. And I think we need to change that culturally, because I don't think we're ever going to produce the best educated children while we've got a view that, educators are just sort of sitting around doing nothing. They work very hard. They work within very strict regulatory frameworks, which I think should be loosened to some extent if we want to support more innovation. And they're doing great work. But if they don't have the right tools in their hand and they're not funded properly and they don't have the infrastructure, of course they're not going to be as successful. And I think that's why we need to connect primary, secondary, FB and universities together into one model across one backbone, IT backbone, and we need to make sure that that's safe. But we need to have more interaction, I think, between the sectors, between the educational sectors, because there's so much we're learning in one sector and not in the other. And there's plenty, to be honest, that if you look at block teaching, universities have taken that, by the way, from schools. So, it's happening across. The idea that it should just be going one way is also wrong. You in a relationship, you're learning from each other, and I think that's an important thing. And we need to look at that model as a localized regional model, not just for the security of the people and the citizens, but also to really start to move forward in innovating education, because I think there's a lot more we can do. And as soon as we start to introduce immersion into learning, I mean, the world is literally in the classroom at that point, and you can teach everything. It's such an exciting period for learning. I just think if you can't get excited now, when are you going to get excited? But I do think we have a different government. We have a more positive sort of view. But I think culturally, we do need to start thinking about how we work with educators and how we, what we think of them, societally.
I think, I think it goes back to that thing that you mentioned earlier, that the data might be there, but ultimately it's the story they tell and how you win the hearts and minds along with it. I think if you think of, we had Sophie Pickles on the podcast talking about play-based learning, but also ultimately, you said you're a scientist, whether you're an engineer, whatever you are, like ultimately play is maybe classified and termed differently, but it's tinkering, it's exploring, it's experimenting. It's all of those things, but actually, as soon as you call it play, then it becomes a child's game. And ultimately, and I'm just like, it's not. Like, I just think more application to context rather than sitting and listening.
Exactly.
And the whole conversation around these kind of things is, yes, but to do an experiment, they need knowledge. And I'm like, who said they don't need knowledge? Who said, well, this is why we have to stand there? And I was like, what, for 16 years? Like, we have to do that? Like, that's a long foundation level to just stand and chat and for 16 years. I think it needs to be a mixture and a blended approach to it. Like, it can't be just one way or the other. And I think that's always been the narrative of knowledge or skills, this or this. It has to be, as like the whole conversation has been technology or not. Well, why not an approach which is considered and pulled in? And do you feel that, maybe in Hitchy, but just in general, do you feel that is probably one of the reasons why the AI response in the UK is so fractured? Do you feel that actually there's some people that are so anti it and some people that are for it, that it's just it's creating a real mixed, whoever you get in front of you and whatever your teacher in your school is like is how quality and how much tools and technology you're going to use, which there's no standardization, is there? But maybe, I don't know if you can talk at that, Sarah.
Yeah, I think you're right to call this out. I think also it's really hard for me because, I've worked across the HE sector and it's a mixed bag, there's such different pedagogies across, if you look at Oxford, you've got 1 to 3 pupil lecturer ratios. And then you've got, maybe groups of 300 potentially doing engineering in another university that might be more teaching focused university, for example. So, I mean, you can't use the same pedagogic models when you're dealing with 1 or 2 people than when you're dealing with 500 students. Do you know what I mean? So there's so much work and variation of pedagogy already in there in each sector. So it's very difficult to really generalize, to be honest. But it does feel to me like there are certain things that we can do, and there's certain things that we are going to find really difficult to do. And I think one of the things we did with Serious Games Institute was we were trying to sort of say, look, games play can be serious. And we've seen how brilliant simulations and games are for training in, military, in medical, in, high impact areas. My own study was on triage, was on medical triage, and we worked with the NHS on that study. So I mean, there's so many learnings, there's so many things in this. But I think if we keep a really simple spine of a blended model, and I will try to point you'll love my research report, Steve, because it's basically saying, look, this is the model across the whole piece. And this is how we do it, and this is what the mix, and these are the elements we can change. But in order to get to that place, we have to reduce curriculum pretty significantly. I think we could reduce it by a third without even feeling anything at all. And then
also do it differently. And also do it completely different.
We can do it
if you look at if you look at COVID and people say, delivering on Teams is so much harder, but why are you delivering on Teams in the way that you deliver in a classroom? That's not blended learning. I think I wrote my first blended learning strategy in 2015, maybe, I think it was, in regards to the college and the work that we were doing. And it wasn't just me. Like, no, it was cascading. There was some wonderful stuff out there. Labster was an organisation we worked with. We were building new science labs. Are they Danish?
Yeah, he's
Are they from
Danish.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah. So we worked, I think this was 2015, 2016 with them, looking at that and looking at the experiments. And I just think, but ultimately, the whole conversation with every member of the team, every head of department, every leader in that organisation was think differently. Blended learning is around a variation, and in the classroom, it's about variation and variety. It's not one size fits all. It's not one delivery methodology. Think about, and as you go down a corridor, you might see an empty classroom for a period. You might see difference in classrooms, and you'll see very different looks and feels of what learning looks like, because that's what learning is. Learning is different from day to day, from person to person, from subject to subject, and all of those different things. And also, how do we create the structures around it, around attendance and registers and all those kind of things for supporting blended learning. But yeah, I think it's just really key that we have to think differently around learning online and away from the physical, and ultimately that can be foundational.
yeah. But I think your point about, it's not either or, it's everything. Let's look at everything, put everything on the table. What I've tried to do in that report is to say, look, this is what I think the optimal blend could be. But the point is, you can change that. You'll be able to change every element. But what's interesting about the model, I think, is that, you've got curriculum, you've got skills, you've got social and personal. And actually, the model is blending that. And each school even might have slightly different blends. They might have, I don't know, 70% curriculum and 20% skills and 5% personal, 5% social, for example. But I think that model that I put forward, I feel actually quite strong, that actually that can work across all the different sectors. I put forward a model which is a LEAR model: learn, explore, apply, and reflect, which I think also has been quite well received by the schools, but I've introduced it to and into universities as well. And it's something that could sort of pull the bits together. But I think ultimately it is the assessment piece. So in our school, we had almost like two lines. We had an academic line, and then we had a project-based line. And the project-based line was a City and Guilds accredited, and then of course the academic line, which would be normal accreditation from university accreditation. And what I felt was that we could probably keep elements of both, but just start to increase that project base, that that more meaningful and easier for social learning to take place. That line of assessment, I think, needs to be deepened. I'm not saying that we abandon the academic strain at all, because I think that fits so brilliantly into going to university and that line, that pathway. But as you said, we need to look at skills, we need to look at apprentices, and we need to look at, not just academic roles. And I think the university sector deals with that quite well, because, as we had polytechnics and universities, and now we have all universities. There are still universities that focus more on, training nurses and doctors and paramedics and so on, and others that are more focused on, economists and politicians and civil servants and so on. So, we have a very interesting segment there, but how it's architected all the way through, that's the bit where I think we can bring more in. And I think technology can play a role there, not everything, and certainly not replacement. And of course, AI is the area where I think there is the greatest fear. And what I found with, as soon as AI started to come in 2023 or whatever, I could see it straight away. It felt like the shutters were sort of slowly coming down from the academic. And I think what's been worrying is that it's almost like, oh, well, the children can use the AI, but the teachers can't. And I don't know. I don't understand. I think you either have to go with it or not go with it. I don't think you can have this. Some people can use it and some people can't. I think nobody uses it, which makes it easy and clean, or they have to use it within a more structured sort of environment. And I think that's the work that we're trying to do at Waypoint, is really to say, look, well, we'll do the filtering of the, get the best out of the AI and then give you what you need. You shouldn't have to be spending, your life sorting through, I don't know what, 30, 40 different applications that do that particular thing. There should be a way that that's just easy for you. As a teacher. And so that's sort of what we're trying to do. We're trying to work with teachers to provide those sorts of tools. But I think with AI, you're right. The response has been, I think the response was very much shut us down. That was my feeling. But I think, again, it's like any technology, some educators have really embraced it, some haven't, and there's a lot of variation across the sector. It was like this before, remember? And then we brought LMSs in, and then now everybody has an LMS. So I think it'll be corrected over time, but I think it is a real challenge at the moment. And, people don't know what they don't know. And I think it's fearful. And I think if you're an educator, you don't want to risk it. So from my point of view, I'd rather we don't deal with that at all in primary and secondary, and then work through. And this is why I think we need a research council. We need more funding around the research in this area, because we need to actually really understand what are the issues here. We need to do that research, we need to do the analysis, and we need to have more scientific basis to make those decisions.
Absolutely, and I think there's lots of weight in what we're talking about there in terms of evidence-based approaches and making sure that we can make effective decisions. And it's good to see that there are some glimmers of hope. And for many of our listeners, they might be in the trenches of trying to make this happen, but there are people right at that policy level and at that university level, and then even at that corporate level that are trying to make that happen. So thank you for that. We always end our podcasts with 3 quick fire questions. The emphasis is probably more for us than it is for you on it being quick fire. So we ask a question, and so there's 3 of them. I'll ask the first one, Steve will ask the second, and then I'll ask the final one. So the first one is, if schools were judged like restaurants by how much customers actually enjoyed the experience, what would change overnight?
If schools were restaurants,
if they were judged like restaurants, what would change?
Probably not much, because you've still got the regulatory framework, haven't you, that you're working to. So until the regulatory framework massively changes, I don't see it would be different. Except our regulatory framework isn't, you get 5 stars. Our regulatory framework is, well, they could close you. So it's a more ferocious. Well, I suppose they could with restaurants as well. They can close you, can't they?
They can close you for hygiene.
I think they're the same. Oh my God.
They can do that. You say, "Well, we don't judge by 5 stars." You just mentioned league tables at the beginning of the conversation. There are. The stars and stripes given out across, but just with different terminology. Sarah's just like, "Oh my God, we are restaurants. We are just like restaurants."
It's almost worse than restaurants, because we've got so many, because you've got the students that say what they like, which is quite major. Then you've got obviously the parents and other people that say whether they like it. And then you've got the regulatory framework, which says where you are. And then you've got the THE, which says where you are in the sector as well. And then you've got the international one, which tells you where you are in relation to all the universities in the world. I mean, it's an incredible thing, isn't it, really, education? But yeah, I don't think anything would change, actually, because I think maybe it would loosen up because we have got a lot of regulation. I think maybe that's something people don't always appreciate. Sometimes we want to do things and we can't, because there's genuine regulation, and the regulatory framework for universities is tightening, like it has for schools, and we've seen the impact of regulation in schools and what that can do to teachers and how bad they can feel from it. So I'm not sure that all the tables and league tables, I mean, we're so used to it now, I can't imagine it going away, but we are a very competitive sector, and I think it will continue to be like that, because we're not just competing with the other university in the same city, we're competing with all the universities around the whole world. And it is different for schools, because you have a catchment area, and so it's a different animal. But yeah, we're big businesses now, and we operate in that way. So probably not so much restaurants, but maybe restaurant chains. International restaurant chains.
Next one is, what's the most dangerous myth that educators tell themselves to avoid real change?
We don't do it like this here.
Love it.
Great answer. And the final one is, if a 10-year-old asked you why they have to go to school, what would you actually say?
So you can learn about the world and be excited by knowledge, and so that you can, in time, contribute to this amazing society that we're part of, and this history that we're part of. We're all part of that, aren't we? That history.
Absolutely. We don't do this here. Love that. But
I've had that. I've actually had that.
Yeah, well, I think we all have. I think we still do. But it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, the conversations, to hear about some of the research that came out around play and gaming and all of the different things in immersion, which started probably before, but that goes back to 2010, and all of those kind of things. So it's been great to hear it. Hopefully the stories begin to tell what the research is showing, and we win hearts and minds over, and immersion and games and the variation and blended becomes the norm and just becomes learning rather than blended learning, and all those different things. But Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and great conversations as always. To those people, if this has gone out and you are still not hooked onto the Edufuturist Uprising, Ben's going to tell you where the link is in the show notes and tell you what the actual link is, because I'm terrible at it. But we are still on 25th of June 2026, Invisible Win Factory in Liverpool. We will see you there, or we won't. I don't know what
you
else
miss
to say
out if
about
you
it,
don't
really.
come. Edufuturist.com.
miss out, all those kind of things. Edufuturist.com/uprising
26.
You see, I'm almost with the 26.
Yeah.
So you see, this is why Ben does it miles better than me. It's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Shaping the next generation. Dancing to the rhythm, catching every beat. Together we embrace the futures at our feet. The futures